Hi everybody, welcome to the fifth video for Business Management 3-4. This is the final video for Area Study 2, and today we're going to be covering termination management, the roles of the workplace participants, and also dispute resolution. So to start off with, we're going to focus on termination. So termination is where the working relationship ends due to the employee leaving the business. And termination can either be voluntary, where the employee chooses to leave, such as resignation or retirement, and it can also be involuntary. So that's where the business forces the employee to leave, and that's through dismissal and redundancy. We're going to go through each of those four in a bit more detail. To start off with, termination has a serious effect on corporate culture, and so as we're going through the rest of the four termination issues, we're going to be thinking about the transition issues and the way that that termination affects the corporate culture in the business. Termination is also very expensive for a business because as an employee leaves, they need to be replaced, and that replacement needs to be trained. In addition to the loss of productivity, as that employee leaves the business. So to start off with, we're going to talk about resignation. So resignation is where the employee chooses to leave the business. This might be because they want a better job, they're relocating, they don't like the job for whatever reasons. And something that's specific to resignation is an exit interview. So when an employee chooses to leave the business, the manager or the HR manager should conduct an exit interview, sit down with them and understand the reasons why the employee is leaving, and if there's anything they can do to prevent further employees from leaving because of that issue. In relation to resignation, with entitlement issues, these are things that the business has to legally provide the employee who's leaving. And so with resignation, it's not very detailed. It's only any outstanding pay and any outstanding annual leave that has accrued. So employees are entitled to four weeks of annual leave every year. If they don't take that, it goes on to the next year. So when they leave, they might be entitled to several weeks of annual leave, and any pay that's owing as well. A transition issue for resignation is the fact that the loss of corporate culture and corporate culture may be affected by having employees been at the business for a long time or a well-liked employee leaving the business, and that can affect the morale within the business. In terms of transition issues and entitlements, resignation isn't super detailed. So if you had a choice, I'd probably go for one of the ones that we're about to discuss rather than resignation. The next one is retirement. So retirement is when the employee leaves the business because they no longer want to be a part of the labour force. And usually that's when the employee reaches 65 because they're entitled to that superannuation that the employer has been paying whilst they are working at the business. So entitlements from the business perspective are the same. They have to provide the employee with any outstanding pay and any outstanding annual leave. Their employees entitled to their superannuation, but that's not the business having to provide that. That's the government. The transition issues for retirement is quite significant. And so this is one where I would definitely talk about if you have the choice. So retirement is obviously a big issue for an employee. It's a big transition from working 9 to 5 every day for 40 years to one day just not having anything to do. So the business can allow the employee to work part-time in the lead up to retirement to kind of allow them to adjust and have settle into having some free time, but also still having some involvement in the business. Also, the employee can be involved in social events after retirement, again, to help them feel like they're part of the business and not feel super lost once they have, no job and no work requirements. And another thing that they could do is they could involve the retiring employee in training. So because they've been working at the business for a very long time, they could have them train new employees or, be involved in training in some way. From the remaining employee's perspective, it may affect the corporate culture if an employee who's been at the business for a very long time has left. And so that may mean that the business will need to, have social events to kind of boost the corporate culture. The next termination issue is redundancy. So redundancy is an involuntary termination issue where the business forces employees to leave. And that's because their job no longer exists. Maybe it's too expensive. There's no need for that certain type of role anymore. Corona is a good example of that. With coronavirus, there was a lot of jobs that, businesses couldn't afford to upkeep, so people were made redundant. There are two different types of redundancy that are good to note. So first is voluntary redundancy. So usually when a business is, forced to make employees redundant, they will first, explain the issue to employees and say, is there anybody who would like to be made redundant? Because when you're made redundant, you are entitled to a large redundancy package, which is several weeks of your pay, depending on how long you've worked in the business. So if there were any employees who were thinking of leaving anyways, or thinking of retiring anyways, or they wanted a career change, they may take up that voluntary redundancy and, receive that money. And that reduces the impact on the employees who, have financial commitments, mortgages, young children, all those kinds of things, who if were made redundant, it would have a more, serious effect upon them. However, if there is not enough employees who take up the voluntary redundancy offer, then the business will make employees involuntarily redundant and force them to leave the business. So entitlement issues with redundancy are the same: any outstanding pay and any outstanding annual leave. And as we just spoke about, also you're entitled to redundancy package. And so that amount depends on how long the employee's worked in the business. I think if you've worked there for about 10 years, you get about 3 months pay. And if you've worked there for 1 to 3 years, it's like a couple weeks of pay. Transition issues with redundancy is also significant. So this is definitely one that I would choose if you have a choice to talk about in the SACRA exam. So the business can try to reduce the stress and anxiety on employees losing their source of income and their job by providing them with outplacement services. So outplacement services help employees write resumes and gain employment opportunities after they've been made redundant. The business can also provide counselling and can also be a bit more lenient with employees, allowing them to have time off work to gain new employment opportunities, attend job interviews, all those kinds of things. In regards to the remaining employees, the ones who aren't made redundant, there's going to be a serious loss of corporate culture and an anxiety, around the business, because remaining employees will also be fearful that they may be made redundant in the future if the business performance continues to decline. So the business will need to implement social activities or a different management style in order to boost that corporate culture back up. And the final termination issue, which is again involuntary, is dismissal, which is where the employee is forced to leave the business either because of poor performance or some breach of conduct. And there are two different types of dismissal that you should know. The first one is summary. So summary is when the employee is fired on the spot. They're given no notice and no opportunity to improve. And that's for serious breaches of conduct, such as harassment, theft. And the opposite of that is on notice. So employees are usually given at least one warning before they are fired to allow them to improve, because the impacts of dismissal are quite significant. In terms of entitlement issues, it's just your basic outstanding pay and annual leave. And transition issues also aren't very detailed. So I would definitely choose either redundancy or retirement if you can. Really, the only real issue would be, from the business perspective, the loss of corporate culture. If, it's a long-standing employee who's been fired, if someone's been fired on notice, might make any other employees fearful that they'll also be fired because of poor performance. But in some cases, if an employee was fired because of theft or harassment on, a summary dismissal, the morale and corporate culture may actually improve because these undesirable traits are removed from the business. So that brings us to the end of termination. Now we're going to be moving on to our workplace relations section of the area study. Within workplace relations, we focus on two different ways of paying employees and determining their working conditions. And then we work on to the different participants in the workplace. I think it's personally better to learn about the awards and agreements first. And then as you go through the roles of the workplace participants, being HR manager, trade unions, you understand what they do in relation to each awards and agreements better. So we're going to start off with the award. So the award is the legally binding minimum wages and conditions of work. So every single employee within a specific industry will have the same pay and working conditions. And there are 122 different industries in the award. So there may be a different award for hospitality employees, as retail employees, as employees in all different industries. And the award is created by the Fair Work Commission every 4 years. And so what the Fair Work Commission does is they receive submissions from employees, employers, trade unions within that specific industry, and they then determine what is fair pay and working conditions for employees. The award will outline things such as meal breaks, holiday pay, penalty rates, as well as pay. And it must adhere to the 10 national employment standards, which are outlined by the Fair Work Commission, which outline, again, minimum standards of employment in Australia. So the award applies to all employees unless they are on an agreement, which we'll talk about in a second. So the award is the safety net. Anything below the award is illegal. It's the minimum pay and working conditions that can be provided to employees in Australia. The award is good because it's very easy to establish. You just pay employees what the Fair Work Commission says. There's no negotiations or anything like that. The issue with the award is that it's not specific to the business's needs. It's the same for every single business in the industry. McDonald's will have the same pay as employees in a different hospitality, in a nice restaurant, if they weren't on an agreement. So that's a potential issue. And the other potential issue is that because it's basic pay and working conditions, it can actually demotivate employees because they don't feel like the business rewards them and values their hard work. And that brings us on to the agreement. So the agreement is instead wages and conditions of work that are agreed upon by employees and employers. And the terms of the agreement are created through what we call enterprise bargaining. What that is negotiations between employees and employers. There may also be the HR manager, trade unions present, and they will work out a mutually beneficial agreement that pays employees a fair amount and also achieves the business objectives. The pay isn't too high that's going to reduce the business's profit or make the business unprofitable. The most important thing to know about the agreement is that it must be better off overall than the relevant award. So the employees either have to have better pay, better flexibility in working hours and that kind of thing, or better working conditions. And the Fair Work Commission will approve the agreement and make sure that it is in fact better off overall than the award. The Fair Work Commission also makes sure that the agreement applies to the 10 national employment standards, which are the basic 10 needs of employees in Australia. So the agreement applies to all employees within that industry, and it has to be approved by a majority vote of all employees in that business before it is binding and valid. The good thing about the agreement is that it's tailored to the business's specific needs. So if a business needs better job flexibility and working arrangements for parents with young children, they can put that in the agreement for them. Or if they need to be open 24 hours a day, they can work out a way to pay their employees a better flat rate, say $25 instead of $20 every time of the day, no matter what time, and avoid paying penalty rates for overnight pay and that kind of thing. So it's more specific to the business's needs. However, it is very time consuming to establish, and it can cause conflict if the employees and managers can't agree. But because employees are paid better off overall or receiving better working conditions or job flexibility, it's more motivating for employees. And that means better quality work and more productive employees. So now we work on to the workplace participants. And the first one that we talk about is trade unions. So trade unions are responsible for advancing the interests of employees to ensure that employees receive fair working conditions and pay. So the trade unions will represent employees within a specific industry and represent employees in enterprise bargaining for agreements. So when the agreement is being created in the business, trade unions will say our employees deserve better pay and make sure that they're not taken advantage of by the employer. They also can make claims to the Fair Work Commission when the award is being created. So as we said before, remember the award applies to the industry. So they can say, we represent employees in retail. Retail workers need better meal breaks. and that will be considered by the Fair Work Commission when they create the award. The trade unions can also make a claim to the Fair Work Commission to have industrial action protected. What that means is that if employees need to go on strike, they can't be fired because they have not attended work and instead gone on strike. The opposite of that is the employer associations. So employer associations represent the employee's interests, so the employer's interests, and make sure that they're not taken advantage of by the employee. And that means that ensuring that the pay and working conditions are fair and not making the business unprofitable when creating the agreement. So as well as that, the employer associations will represent employers in any type of disputes if employees and employers can't agree on an agreement. Next, we have the Human Resources Manager. So Human Resources Manager, remember, they're kind of like an intermediary between the employees and the employer. So their main role is to improve the working relationship between the two and ensure that the business is productive and there's a positive corporate culture. So the Human Resources Manager is responsible for recruiting motivated, productive, experienced employees, terminating any employees that aren't hardworking or, breach any codes of conduct. They also are responsible for mediating between employees and employers if there are any disputes that arise within the business. If they can't agree on an agreement through enterprise bargaining, then the HR manager will come in and try to resolve the dispute. The HR manager is also responsible for ensuring that employees are paid the right amount and staying up to date with any changes in the award and making sure that employees are being paid under the award correctly or being paid under the agreement. The HR manager will also send the final agreement to the Fair Work Commission in order for the Fair Work Commission to approve it and for it to be binding. In regards to the HR manager, a consultative or participative management style is usually best, one where the employees can also express their concerns and provide some ideas prior to the manager making a decision, either making decisions as a team through participative or where the manager takes those ideas into account when making their final decision through centralized decision making. And one final thing is that for HR managers, interpersonal skills are essential because sometimes they need to have difficult roles in the business. They need to be responsible for resolving disputes, having difficult conversations about termination. So they need to be aware of the way that they're communicating information to employees or managers in order to evoke the right kind of response, rather than screaming at employees that they're fired, conveying that in a more sensitive way. The next type of workplace participant is the Fair Work Commission. So we've spoken about the Fair Work Commission quite a lot, but just to reiterate, the Fair Work Commission is Australia's workplace tribunal to ensure that employment and labour laws are enforced. So the Fair Work Commission, remember, creates the award every 4 years, and they outline the 10 national employment standards that both the agreement and award have to adhere to, things that outline of 4 weeks of annual leave, public holidays, penalty rates, all those kinds of things. The Fair Work Commission also approves the agreement to make sure that they're better off overall for employees, and they also protect employees for industrial action. So we already kind of spoke about this in relation to trade unions, but that means that employees can't be fired for going on strike. And the Fair Work Commission can protect them from being fired if employees feel the need to go on strike. The final thing for this area study is dispute resolution. So dispute resolution is, detrimental to the business's corporate culture and productivity because the employees are distracted by issues and, disagreements, and also from a corporate culture perspective, employees and managers are not harmonious. So there are a few different ways that employees and employers can express their, disapproval and disagreement. One would be strike, where employees refuse to go to work and protest for better pay or better working conditions. Another one is where the manager actually locks out their employees from attending work. And finally, picket line is where the employees will line up around the business and prevent customers from coming in. So all of those are used as a form of disputes within the business. So the next thing is to talk about how to resolve those kinds of disputes that, you know, are sort of inevitable in businesses at some point, you know, whether that be employees unhappy with wages or managers unable to agree on, you know, what wages and conditions of work under an agreement. So the first kind of step is to try to resolve the issue internally with the HR manager's support without, you know, having the public eye and the media involved in it getting, you know, affecting the business's reputation in any way. If, however, the business can't resolve the issue internally, they can next try mediation, which is a bit more of a formal dispute resolution process. Mediation is where the independent third party facilitates discussion between the employer and the employees so that the employee and the manager can resolve the conflict themselves. All they really do is ask things like, how do you feel about that? Or is there anything you'd like to add to that? They don't actually make any suggestions or make a decision on behalf of the employee or manager. They make the decision entirely themselves. And so because the managers and employees reach decision themselves, they're more likely to accept it because it's, you know, something that they might come up with on their own. And it's usually a compromise between the managers and employees. Just something to note is that for mediation, it can be the HR manager who resolves the dispute and acts as that third party. And if mediation is unsuccessful, and you know the issue is, you know, too significant and there's a lot of animosity between the parties, then arbitration is often used. Arbitration is where the Fair Work Commission will hear both sides of the dispute and they will make a decision as to how to resolve the issue. And that decision is legally binding. So it's more formal, more kind of like a court setting where one party will present their side of events and the employer will do the opposite. They'll just do the same, sorry. They'll present their side of events and, you know, what they believe they should receive. And then the Fair Work Commission will say, this is what's going to happen. And the employees and managers can't do anything about it. That's legally binding. And so that may be, you know, detrimental to corporate culture as well, because there's no sort of compromise. One party wins, one party loses. And the parties aren't able to kind of resolve it themselves. So that brings us to the end of Area Study 2 and the end of this video. I hope that you have learned something and it's been enjoyable.